Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football, the conversation that the Oregon Duck fans will be having over the next 8 months, the question that Dan Lanning will be looking to answer over the next 8 months. How does this Oregon Ducks program get over the hump in 2025 and win a national championship? I got a couple of takes I want to get into, but I want to start with this talking point. Hey, we all remember, where Oregon was when Dan Lanning took over. We all remember that first game against Georgia where it just looked like it was two different teams playing at two different levels. Now you fast forward to where Oregon is right now. Not only the expectations within the program for the Oregon Ducks, but how the national media talks about this program. This is one of those programs, and they ain't that many in college football. This is one of them that every single year the expectation is to win a national championship. That's exactly where Oregon Duck fans want to be. That's exactly the expectations Dan Lanning wants to have. So I think first and foremost, although Oregon went out and for lack of better terms, played their worst football against Ohio State in the Rose Bowl, this is still a team that is clearly going in the right direction. Under a young head coach who's a first time head coach, I think it's important for us to all recognize who is, starting to master what the recipe is to get the most out of his football teams. There's a lot to be optimistic about in terms of where the Oregon Ducks are going in the future of the program. Now, where I want to start here, and this is not groundbreaking analysis, but when you listen to athletes or coaches talk about winning at the highest level. Look, I ain't got no experience winning at the highest level as an athlete, but I've listened to a lot of athletes and coaches who have a lot of experience. The same thing comes up, and that is, look, you got to play your best football in the biggest moments. If you want to win a national championship, you got to play your best football in the months of December and January. And that's obviously where Oregon kind of fell short. Now, there's a couple of different takes for that. One, if you've ever played a sport, you're not going to play your best football every single time, and that's just how athletics, that's how competition goes. But I do think, secondly, and this is kind of an interesting talking point, this was Dan Lanning and Oregon's first time in the college football playoffs, and it's a very weird period when you win that Big Ten championship, you get to bye in the first round of the playoffs. That's what, nearly a month of which you're not playing a live game of football. What do you do in those 4 weeks? Look, Ohio State, Ryan Day, they've been in this position multiple times over the last couple of years. They've had those trial and error times where it's like, hey, this is what it should look like. This is what it looked like last year. This doesn't work. We're going to change our recipe, our structure in those 4 to 5 weeks. I'm guessing Dan Lanning and the Oregon Ducks are going to be looking at that time period between when you finish up a Big Ten championship win against Penn State and then when you have to go play in the Rose Bowl and say, hey, how do we best get our team ready to play that first snap of the football game? Because that was clearly something that Ohio State was ready, Oregon wasn't. I think it's going to get better. Look, I feel very comfortable saying this. The Oregon Ducks will probably be in the playoffs next year, and I'm guessing that 4-week off period, it's going to look a little bit different from a preparation standpoint than it did last year for Oregon. And I think they're going to get better and be a little bit more ready to play in those biggest moments. Now, from a roster, from a football standpoint, I think there's some other takes I want to get into. Now, before we get into it, as always, to the Oregon Duck fans, y'all know it. It's really been a blast talking this program for the last 12 months, covering what they did in the transfer portal, covering the spring practice, fall camp, getting into 2024, watching them play some really good football at times. I've had a blast doing it. The amount of support y'all continue to show, it means the absolute world. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, let it fly in the comment section. These are the talking points that we're going to have for the next 8 months before we see football again. And so I'd love to hear from you guys in the comment section. Appreciate you guys. Without further ado, let's get into the 3 things I want to talk about. Number one, better depth. I think depth was an issue for Oregon at a couple of different spots, and we have the projected depth chart going into 2025, but I want to scroll down to the defensive side of the football and talk about what the depth looked like on the defensive line, because this was, to me, a little bit of a problem for Oregon. And you look at why Oregon might have not played a couple of different things. One, Oregon historically did not play very good in the second half of football games, right? They would come out and beat some teams that they were supposed to beat bad in the first half, and then it'd be kind of sluggish, sloppy second halves. And then obviously Oregon against Penn State and then against Ohio State on defense did not play their best football either. Why might that be a talking point we want to pull on? If you want to play your best football in the month of December and January, you got to be deep. 12 plus games, it's a long season. And quite frankly, it's a long football game, right? It's 4 hours. You want to keep your big bodies fresh. Guys like Derek Carmen, guys like Jamari Caldwell, those big bodies that go 300 plus pounds. What makes an elite defensive line? Yes, one is having guys like Derek Carmen who can go wreck a game, are some of the best football players we see in the sport. But secondly, what happens when Derek Carmen is off the football field? Do you have adequate guys you can trot onto the football field and not really have your level of play drop that much? I don't think Oregon had that. And because of that, Derek Carmen played nearly 600 snaps in the 2024 season. Jamari Caldwell played almost over 529 snaps. That's a lot of football for your big bodies to play on the defensive line. And so you start having that conversation of, hey, how does Oregon get over the hump? It's circled around, hey, how do we play our best football late in the season? Being a deep team, being able to cycle in guys on the defensive line, keep your best players fresh, not only for 4 quarters, but 12 plus games of a season becomes really important. You look at Michigan in the 2023 year when they won their national championship. You look at the last couple of Georgia teams too. What do they all have in common? They played one. They played their best football in the 4 quarters, but more importantly, they played their best football late in the season. I think a lot of that had to do with depth. Now, I don't think defensive line was the only one because you look at the offensive line and Oregon had to go to the transfer portal and grab 2 new offensive tackles. It's a good thing that this did not happen. Josh Connerly and Johnny Cornelius, they're great tackles. They're both going to have successful NFL careers. The depth on the offensive line, specifically at the tackle position, was a question. What happened if Josh Connerly had to miss a few games? Like, do you have a third tackle or a fourth tackle that you feel comfortable can go out and win you and play you winning football? I'm not sure if Oregon had that either. And quite frankly, at the wide receiver spot, when Tez Johnson went down, when Evan Stewart wasn't able to play in the Rose Bowl, not sure if they were deep enough at wide receiver either. The depth of this Oregon team probably wasn't quite where it needed to be. Now, that starting Oregon Ducks team, 11 on offense, 11 on defense, it was very, very good. No doubt it was national championship caliber. The depth seemed to be probably a little bit lacking. And what's the fix? In my opinion, it's time. Again, Dan Lanning, he's still a young head coach, but new in his tenure. How do you develop depth at the college football level? You don't use the transfer portal for depth. Use the high school recruiting trail. You stack really good classes. Dan Lanning just hasn't really had the time yet to start stacking those classes, but we've seen him what he's doing on the recruiting trail. It's clearly going in the right direction. This Oregon team will become deeper as time goes on. And you start looking at this Oregon team in 2025, there are a lot of positions where you look at quarterback with Dante Moore. You look potentially in the back end with some of these young defensive backs, maybe some of the talented defensive linemen, and say there's a lot of parts on this team that could get better from what they were in 2024. But I think most notably, the most important thing that needs to improve is how deep this team is. Because if you want to play your best football late in the season, you got to be deep. And so that's probably the number one thing that kind of jumps out at me. Number two, athletes on defense need to be elite. And I'm just not sure it quite was that at all 3 levels. There were some really, really good players for Oregon in 2024, right? Derek Carmen on the inside, Teo Yu, Jabbar Muhammad. They had some real studs who would be playing in the NFL at some point. Mateo Yu's got another year. There were certain positions that just weren't elite, weren't good enough, in my opinion, specifically at safety. And this is not a knock at guys like Kobe Savage. This is not a shot at a guy like Tasheem Johnson, who pretty clearly was playing a little bit out of position in 2024, much more comfortable playing nickel. We saw how, you start looking at the teams you're going to have to be to win national championships. The first couple come to mind: Ohio State, probably Texas. What do Ohio State and Texas have big time in common? They got dudes out on the wide receiver spot. They got athletes in space. If you want to deal with them, you got to have the athletes to match it. And you look at Kobe Savage on the shorter end, probably on the slower end. Probably could say the same thing for a guy like Tasheem Johnson. To me, it just wasn't good enough. And I think it was very obvious in that football game in the Rose Bowl. You look at what Oregon has coming back, or coming into the program and coming back. I think the athleticism is just going to be on another level. You look at Peyton Woodyard, going to be a second-year cat. Kingston Lope, Aaron Flowers. You're bringing Dylan Tiemann through the portal. You have guys like Naheem Offord and Brandon Finney, two of which are some of the more impressive cornerback athletes that you see in the class. Oregon is going to be bigger, stronger, faster in the back end. And I think that was one of those spots where they clearly fell short in 2024. And it's going to be something that if you want to consistently beat those teams in the college football playoffs, Ohio State teams like Texas, you got to have the athletes to match their athletes in space. And last one, and this is kind of being nitpicky, but I do want to just talk about it for a second. Force more turnovers. You look at Oregon's compiled stats and team metrics, almost everything's in the top 10. They're not almost, but there's a lot of stats for Oregon, top 10. One thing that they were outside of the top 100 on, forcing turnovers on defense. And it's something Tosh Lupoy, it's important to him. 1.2 turnovers per game. That's 100th in the country. And look at some of the other teams in the college football playoffs. Notre Dame leads the country in turnovers. Texas, I believe, is top 5. They're number 11 in turnovers per game. You look at that and say that was maybe something that just wasn't quite good enough for Oregon in 2024 and something that you will want to improve. There will be people that say turnovers are luck related. To an extent, that might be true. But I also think that as a defense, it's not a coincidence that some of the best defenses are also some of the best defenses at forcing turnovers. And you're kind of looking for it, kind of going back to the general conversation of where we started this conversation, and that is, how do we get over the hump when you're competing at the highest level of something? Again, I don't know nothing about that, but I've heard a lot of people who do know something about that say this. It's fractions of percents. It's not like Oregon needs to make this massive jump. It's like, how can you get 1% better from this year at a couple of different categories? That's going to be good enough to win a national championship. And you start trying to skim off those percents and say, hey, where can we get better as a program? Forcing turnovers on defense, to me, stands out as a big way they can. Look, the Oregon fans probably feel better now with a couple of weeks, but it's never easy to talk about those losses as a Michigan fan. I've been through plenty of them. This thing's going in the right direction. I think a lot of Oregon fans feel confident in that. And we're going to have these type of conversations for the next 8 months and talk about how Oregon finds that 1%, how Oregon gets over the hump in 2025. But I think it starts with getting deeper. That only takes time. And as the years go on and Dan Lanning continues to stack this roster the way he wants, the team's going to be deeper. And it already looks deeper going into 2025. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later.